Good afternoon from the Smith School of Business. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I am the moderator for today's session, Identifying and Delivering the Ultimate Customer Experience. I will be joined shortly by Dr. Lawrence Ashworth, Associate Professor of Marketing here at the Smith School of Business. But first, I want to cover some of the housekeeping stuff and answer any of your early questions. Today's session will be recorded, and you will receive that recording in 2 to 3 business days. We invite you to share it with any friends or colleagues who can't join us today. Next, we encourage you to share our Smith Business Insight webinar invitations within your network. We have a simple sign-up form available at the address you see on your screen. That's ssb.ca/webinars. After you sign up, you'll receive an invitation to our webinars, which cover a variety of business topics, and it is always free to join these webinars. If you have a question while you are listening to today's webinar, please go ahead and ask it at any time. There's no need to wait until the end of the webinar. I will invite you to use the Q&A or the chat panel located in the lower right-hand side of your screen to type in your question. Our presenter will answer any questions that come in at the end of the session today. Now, as far as technical difficulties go, the most common issue is the issue of audio dropping out. Please understand that if your audio does drop out, it's usually only a momentary problem. If you wait a few seconds, it usually comes back on its own. If not, please use your chat window to contact the host. We'll be able to provide you with a phone number you can use to call in, which is usually a more stable platform. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's session leader, Dr. Lawrence Ashworth. Dr. Ashworth is an associate professor in marketing here at the Smith School of Business. He's also a network leader for the National Council of Marketing and Public Affairs Executives. Dr. Ashworth's research focuses on consumer psychology and decision-making. He teaches in the undergraduate, PhD, and MBA programs. A central theme of his teaching is to utilize evidence about how and why consumers react to marketing efforts to help firms make better marketing decisions. His work has been published in a variety of top journals, and he is a frequent media commentator. Dr. Ashworth.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the seminar, Identifying and Delivering the Ultimate Customer Experience. Okay, so I'll take you through a brief overview of what we'll discuss today. There's a few main points that I'd like to get across. First off, that customers' perceived experience matters. I'm going to present some evidence that speaks to this. May seem self-evident to some that experience matters, but I think it's always useful to cover some of the evidence, and it may be useful to others who have to justify their experience initiatives to others in the organization, or those who are just wondering about the evidence linking customer experience to business outcomes. I'm also going to make the point that when we think about experience, you need to consider the holistic experience, that is, consumers' total experience, their experience across all touch points over the entire journey. That's the nature of the experience I'm talking about. I'm going to point out during the webinar that creating good experiences is really hard. Firms routinely mess this up, and I think there are some insights to be gathered from understanding why firms get it wrong. This will highlight at the very least some things to avoid or things to hold in mind when making decisions that are designed to affect customers' experience. Finally, I'm going to finish with a couple of simple suggestions about how to think about experience, and I'm going to leave you with 2 overarching concepts that may help guide your decisions around experience, or at least that is my goal. Okay, so let's first off talk a little bit about some of the evidence around experience. So this is some data that was actually published in the Harvard Business Review, and what the authors were doing is trying to quantify the value of superior customer experiences. And so they collected data from 2 global $1 billion plus businesses. The first one, the data you see here, is a transaction-based business. What they did is they looked at customers' experience at one point in time and then examined their revenue data over the next year, controlling for other possible influences on expenditures. And what you can see here very clearly is as a customer's experience went up, as it was perceived to be more positive, very clearly they spent more in the next year. Similar finding in a subscription-based business. So this is from the same research. In this case, they looked at the probability of being a member the following year and used this to predict how long people would likely be members. So basically what they were doing is looking at their customer experience score and predicting how long those people would remain members in this subscription-based business. And again, you can see as customer experience goes up, the number of predicted years of future membership increases dramatically too. So there's at least some initial evidence that speaks to the importance of experience. Some other evidence here, this is actually for some from the Watermark Consulting group, and what they did here is they looked at the Customer Experience Index leaders. So this is using Forrester's annual Customer Experience Index rankings, and they looked at the leaders, the top 10, and compared them to the laggards, the bottom 10, and looked at their stock market performance relative to the S&P 500. And as you can see quite clearly, the leaders dramatically not only outperformed the market, they substantially, even more so, outperformed the laggards. So customer experience seems to be, at least in this case, related to the stock market performance of firms. There are other benefits to, other than just on the revenue and loyalty side, to experience, at least successful experience programs. So some data from McKinsey, they looked at cost reductions of successful, and I think it's critical to emphasize the successful here, of successful customer journey improvement programs. And they, over 2 to 3 years, they quantified this as between 15 and 25%. And those cost savings came from reduced customer churn, but also from reduced employee churn. Employees are happier dealing with happy customers too and stay longer. Businesses seem to be aware of the importance of customer experience. There's a survey by Adobe and e-consultancy that looked at the number of business-to-business and business-to-consumer organizations focusing on customer experience as a primary way to differentiate, and it was around 50%. So 50% of businesses see this as critically important to how they differentiate. Another survey by Forrester Research found that 73% of businesses say that improving customer experience was a strategic priority. For many of those, it was their top strategic priority. I also want to point out, however, at this stage, that the percent of companies that deliver excellent customer experience, as assessed by customers, at least from this survey, was 1%. So there's something of a mismatch between what businesses say they're pursuing and what they seem to be delivering. There is other evidence that's consistent with this. This is from some data from Harvard Management Update. Percent of businesses that say they deliver a superior experience, 80%. The percent of customers that said those same businesses delivered a superior experience in this survey was 8%. So there seems to be a mismatch between what firms want to do, what they think they're doing, and what they actually are doing in terms of experience. For other firms, Forrester reported recently that only 25% of customer experience professionals say that their company's customer experience programs actually improve experience. And in another survey, they found that 81% of organizations have actually seen their customer experience initiatives fail within the last 3 years. So one of the 2 points I want to make at this stage, first, that customer experience really matters. And second, that organizations are on average not doing an awesome job of this. And what I'd like to turn to now is examine some of the reasons why customer experience initiatives so often fail. I think it's useful for those of you who are have any involvement in customer experience initiatives to understand a little bit about what kind of things cause organizations to mess up. So here are really the 2 broad points I'm going to focus on. This doesn't, of course, capture everything, but these are 2 of the things that I think are most important. The first is that many organizations are focusing on the wrong things. and there's two elements to this in particular that I'd like to talk about. The first is that many organizations focus on touch points, individual touch points, rather than thinking about customer experience from a holistic perspective, understanding customer experience across the entire customer journey. And the second thing, ironically, is that many organizations focus on satisfaction, and you might think that should be what they're doing, but that can lead organizations astray. To be clear here, I'm not saying satisfaction is not important. Quite the contrary. However, it's a particular focus on satisfaction that can actually lead organizations astray, and that's what I'll discuss shortly. And then finally, in many cases, organizations misunderstand what it is that customers really want. So I'll talk about each of these points and hopefully offer some ideas about the kinds of things you can hold in mind when you're thinking about how best to improve your customer's experience. Okay, so the first point, experience versus touch points. So one of the broad points I would make here is that business outcomes are much more closely tied to customers' overall experience rather than their interactions at any individual touch point. I'm just going to start by defining touch point, just so we're sort of clear on what I mean by this. A touch point is any time a potential or existing customer comes into contact with your organization before, during, or after a purchase. So touch points can be a website visit, a tweet, an email, a purchase, a sales call, any time that they come into contact. Many organizations are good or even excellent at satisfying the touch points that they control, but it's critically important to recognize that touch points are only one element of an overall experience. The research that exists that speaks to this strongly suggests that customer experience is significantly more correlated with business outcomes than individual touch points. It's the holistic experience that's important. Here's a quote that I really like that I think captures this nicely. This is from Harvard Business Review. And this article points out that companies have long emphasized touch points, but the narrow focus on maximizing satisfaction at those moments can create a distorted picture, suggesting that customers are happier with the company than they actually are. It also diverts attention from the bigger and, more important, as I've already mentioned, picture customers' end-to-end journey. And this is going to be something of a theme throughout this webinar. Here's one way of thinking about that relationship between touch points and the overall experience. This is actually from McKinsey, and I really like this diagram for making this point. If you imagine at an individual touch point that you've got a certain probability of satisfying customers, and let's say that's high, so individual touch points perform really well in the range of 90% chance of satisfying a customer. Well, over the course, in this case, of 4 touch points, the probability that customers are going to be satisfied overall, of course, is much, much lower. So in this particular example, it would be 60%. The more touch points you add, unless your probability of satisfying a customer is 100% at every touch point, the harder, the lower the probability will be that you've satisfied them across the entire journey. So I think this is a really important point to emphasize. Adding more touch points generally makes it more difficult to satisfy. Yet when organizations think about improving experience, one of the first things they think about doing is adding touch points, not removing them. I will acknowledge, of course, that how many touch points you have, or adding or removing touch points, needs to be balanced with being able to provide the service that customers want. So, of course, you can't remove all touch points. That wouldn't logically make any sense. But adding more can actually make your life more difficult in terms of satisfying customers. In general, I would say it's worth considering whether more touch points are better than fewer touch points. That's a question that is well worth asking, holding this diagram in mind. I'm just going to point out that in many cases, touch points that are added serve very little purpose. There was a recent mall survey, this was published in Business Horizons, that found less than 50% of shoppers experienced most touch points. And many of those touch points were really going unused in the customer journey. Here's some direct evidence. This is from McKinsey again, that just sort of points out the relationship, the stronger relationship between the customer's overall experience, or in this case, they're calling the overall journey, and business outcomes, as opposed to their experience with individual touch points. And what you can see here, the bars on the bottom are the correlations between journey satisfaction with overall customer satisfaction and willingness to recommend versus touch point satisfaction, which are the bars at the top. And you can see that journey satisfaction is just more highly correlated with all of these outcomes across a variety of different industries. Okay, so that's the first point, is this focus on touch points. The second point I'm going to talk about is how focusing on satisfaction can lead organizations astray. And I think this sort of, at least at first glance, should appear somewhat ironic. Here is one of the first points that I want to mention, is that it's not that thinking about satisfaction is inherently bad. I'm not saying that at all. It's not. You need to be concerned with customer satisfaction. It's just that organizations tend to have a very particular view of satisfaction that drives their efforts. They make assumptions about how customers can best be satisfied. This slide here illustrates one of those central assumptions. If you want to satisfy customers, if you ask most organizations how they go about doing it, they're going to say something like this: exceed expectations. There are other phrases that capture this idea that satisfaction is somehow about exceeding. Under-promise and over-deliver, a common phrase that I hear, is really based on this assumption that the way that you satisfy customers is by exceeding whatever expectations they have. Going above and beyond for customers. Again, it's the implication here is that if you want to satisfy customers, you have to go above whatever expectations they hold for their interaction with you. There are some data from Harvard Business Review that I think just points out how entrenched this mindset is in organizations. The percentage of customer service heads that said their main strategy was to exceed expectations, 89%. So you can see that the majority of organizations seem to subscribe to what I just said, that the way if you focus on satisfaction, the way you satisfy customers is by exceeding expectations. So the implicit assumption here is that satisfaction is driven by, it's caused by exceeding expectations. This means that just meeting expectations is not enough, and it even goes beyond that and says that expectations have a very particular relationship to satisfaction, a negative relationship to satisfaction. As expectations go up, holding everything else constant, satisfaction should go down. That is implicit in these set of beliefs. Those set of beliefs, for example, rule out the possibility of a positive relationship between expectations and satisfaction. As expectations go up, maybe satisfaction could go up. So these set of beliefs rule that out. What we know from the research on this is actually that the relationship between expectations and satisfaction is not straightforward at all. It's not exclusively negative or exclusively positive. Expectations can work in weird and wonderful ways, and it's dangerous to assume that they work in one particular way only. I'll give you an illustration of this. So this is in the context of perception, but it's the same basic point. Take a look at this image here. There are two squares with letters in, A and B. You know that as a depiction of reality that those two squares should represent different colors. But what if I told you that the actual colors you're seeing on the screen right now in those squares are identical? You probably wouldn't believe me. You'd say that, no, even on the screen here, they're different colors. Well, I can prove to you that they are, in fact, the same color by placing those two bars there. So what am I using this to illustrate? The reason you see those two squares as different colors, and in fact, it's almost impossible to persuade your mind otherwise until you see those bars placed there, is because you expect those two squares to be different colors. So in this case, expectations have driven the nature of your experience. They haven't conflicted with it. They don't have a negative relationship. They have a positive relationship to it. This finding, there is evidence in consumer research that points out similar things can happen in a marketing context. So we don't need to look through all of this. This is a screenshot that I took from a recent paper that really illustrates this particular point. What the research did here is they basically gave people wine and told them it was either a low price or a high price. It was the same wine. What you would expect, this has not come up as invisible, but the part I was highlighting there, if you look at the liking graph, which is right underneath that little circle there, you can see that people rated the wine they thought was more expensive as better. That implies a positive effect of expectations and satisfaction. They expected the higher priced wine to taste better, and they reported it tasted better. So that's completely inconsistent with the typical view of satisfaction. However, there is, of course, the criticism that, well, maybe they were just reporting that because they thought it should without really experiencing the wine as tasting better. Well, that was the novelty of this experiment. They actually have brain scans. And without going into the details here, if you look on the right, that was the summary of the findings. But basically, they found that people truly experienced more pleasantness tasting the higher priced wine, despite the fact it was an absolute identical wine. The simple point I'm making here is that expectations do not always have the relationship with satisfaction that we expect them to have. And this is a problem, because a focus on satisfaction very often leads to an exceed expectations mindset, and this assumes a very particular effect of expectations on satisfaction, and that is not always true. In fact, in many cases, I would suggest it's not true. Even if it were true, even if exceeding expectations did enhance satisfaction, it's very hard and costly to do anyway. Customers typically come in with high expectations. Trying to exceed those expectations is a very difficult thing to do. It's also costly in the sense that customers hold expectations around the core areas of your business. That's why they come to purchase from you. So trying to do your core area of business better than what customers expect you to do is about the most expensive thing you can attempt to do. There are more efficient ways of delighting customers if that's what you're attempting to do. There are very efficient ways, very inexpensive ways of satisfying customers by doing small things for which they have no expectations at all. I'm not going to get into that now, but they typically revolve around doing satisfying secondary elements of the interaction rather than the primary elements. The other reason a focus on satisfaction can be problematic is that many organizations view improving satisfaction, the route to it, as providing additional or enhanced interactions. So as soon as we start thinking about how do we improve satisfaction, we often think about adding touch points, adding interactions, or enhancing them. And these often don't work. I'll give an illustration of this. Overall, the evidence is tenuous at best between the effect of exceeding expectations on satisfaction. And again, just to be clear, it's not that I'm saying focusing on satisfaction is inherently a bad thing. It's that it tends to lead people to a certain set of beliefs or a mindset around exceeding expectations, which, unless that's exactly how consumers respond, then it can lead organizations astray. Okay, so I showed before that 89% of customer service heads said their main strategy was to exceed expectations. From this same research, the percentage of customers that said their expectations had been exceeded, 16%. So again, even if it were the right thing, it seems to be extremely hard to do. Along those lines, this is some data from Pitney Bowes that looked at the kinds of things that customers found irritating. There's a variety of things there: customer service too chatty or personal, encouraged to join an online community, etc. Many of those things, if you think about it, are actually things the organization did in an attempt to enhance satisfaction. They added elements of to the experience in an attempt to enhance it, but actually these are some of the things that customers find most irritating. In general, this is a good statistic, I think, to hold in mind. This is from a survey of nearly 100,000 customers. The chance any individual customer service touchpoint will lead to disloyalty versus loyalty, they are 4 times more likely on average to lead to disloyalty than loyalty. So just to bolster one of the points I made previously, when you add a touch point in an attempt to improve experience, statistically at least, you've increased the likelihood you will worsen customers' experience. This is somewhat of a secondary point, but I think it's worth mentioning. This really highlights a broader problem when it comes to experience, and that is it's really difficult to know what actually enhances customer experience. And I'm going to illustrate this with a story, or at least the starting point of Apple's retail experience. So Apple has had phenomenal success with their retail outlets. They have, at least the most recent data I could find, sales of approximately $5,500 per square foot. This is the top retail sales per square foot in the US. Just to give you a sense of how other stores compare, Tiffany's is the next highest with $2,900, so really a distant second. The average in the US National Mall average sales per square foot is $341, substantially lower. To give you a sense, in Canada, Canadian Tire sales per square foot are around $283. So Apple's crushing. When Apple enters a store, the mall's overall sales increase by 10%. Everyone in the store benefits from an Apple store. Everyone in the mall, benefits from an Apple store. Apple stores see approximately 300 million visitors per year across 266 stores. It's a phenomenal success story. However they did it, they accurately predicted what experience customers would respond to. The particular experience, as I'm sure many of you know, it's sleek, minimalistic, modern, with limited choice and flat pricing. So those elements, again, for whatever reason, worked. They were very, very successful in choosing the elements that actually created an experience that customers valued. On the basis of this success, Ron Johnson, who was the VP retail, their retail stores, I can't remember his exact title, but Ron Johnson was essentially the architect of Apple retail stores. He was recruited by JCPenney to turn around their flailing fortunes. And so he came into JCPenney on the promise to improve the customer experience. Here's a picture of a JCPenney store before Ron Johnson arrived. In 2012, when he arrived, he dramatically changed the customer experience. So there's a couple of pictures there that illustrate the new experience. It was sleek, it was modern, it had flat pricing. He reduced the number of sales from approximately 590 per year to about 12. The prices on average went down by 40%, a huge reduction in price. They were using an everyday low pricing strategy. So you can see some similarities, many similarities in fact, to the elements that he had used in designing Apple stores. The market responded positively. Stock prices went up by about 25%, something like that. This is a quote from an article at the time, Why JCPenney Will Be the Most Interesting Retailer of 2012. And what happened? Well, I'm sure some of you know, sales fell by over a third. The share price fell by 83%. I don't know how clearly you can see that chart, but since 2012, share prices have fallen by 83% and still haven't recovered. They've reverted back to their former strategy of having many sales, having this high-low pricing strategy, and as I said, they are still struggling. What is the lesson here? What is the point? It's extremely difficult to know ahead of time what actually improves customer experience. And I like the Ron Johnson example simply because this is someone who, on the one hand, created the most successful retail experiences we have literally ever seen, but at the same time got it incredibly wrong in a different context. So it's very, very difficult to know ahead of time exactly what customers are going to respond to. Some other points, some other data related to the broader point that I'm making here, that exceeding expectations doesn't always pay. This is from data, again, the same data I talked about previously of approximately 100,000 customers. The overall relationship between exceeding expectations and loyalty, you can see that there was really no additional improvement in loyalty once customer expectations have been met. So there's very limited payoff in terms of exceeding expectations. There's some very nice psychological research that backs up this idea too. A paper in social psychology and personality science, basically looking at the asymmetric consequences of breaking versus exceeding promises. And what they showed was pretty much exactly what you see here. There's really no advantage for exceeding what you've promised. All of the value comes from meeting what you've promised. So that's another reason why we should be skeptical about adopting a sort of satisfaction or exceeding expectations mindset. There is another point I'd like to mention. This is really a secondary point, but I think it's worth mentioning. A focus on satisfaction typically involves utilizing, as you would expect, satisfaction metrics. And again, just to be clear, I'm not saying satisfaction metrics are not useful. They're extremely useful, but often organizations use metrics for a variety of different purposes. And one of those is to assess their frontline employees, the employees who are actually delivering the experience. One of the problems with satisfaction metrics is they rarely provide frontline employees with a useful guide for their behavior. If you tell 10 different people simply to satisfy customers, you're going to get 10 different responses. And all of those responses are going to be based on people's intuitive beliefs about what they need to do to satisfy people. Most of those intuitive beliefs, as I try to illustrate with the Ron Johnson example, will be wrong. There are other metrics you can use that I think can serve better in this double duty in terms of, in other words, metrics that are useful for the organization to know, like satisfaction is, but also that can provide a guide for the actual behavior you want frontline employees to engage in. I'll talk about one in particular a little bit later on. Okay, so last part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of a couple of different ways of thinking about what customers really want. Obviously, I can't cover everything that customers possibly want in experience because it varies dramatically depending on the particular context we're talking about. But I think there are ways of approaching this question that can be useful in terms of creating your own experiences. So here's the first broad point that I would make, and that is it's useful, I think, to separate out the kinds of things customers are trying to do when they interact with an organization. So on the one hand, you have, I've called these, I don't know if these are the right labels, but this is how I think about it. You have these consumption needs or goals. And what these really capture is consumption is about the extent to which the product satisfies the needs it really was purchased to fulfill. To what extent does your product, conceived broadly, do for customers what they want it to do, what they bought it to do? And there's a set of needs and goals around that. And I would call those consumption needs. And then you've got this sort of other set of needs that I'm calling acquisition needs. That there could be other terms, but it's really designed to get you thinking that, you know, when a customer interacts with your organization, organizations tend to be predominantly concerned with these consumption needs, but actually customers also care a lot about acquisition. And what I mean by that is all of the needs from the moment of consideration, the moment they're considering sort of trying to fulfill their central need to their post-purchase needs. There's a bunch of other stuff customers want to do. There are other needs customers want to fulfill as they pursue their core need. They want to be able to acquire that product in certain ways, and they want certain things in addition to the the core product to happen even after a purchase. And when it comes to customer experience, we really need to hold in mind all of these needs. And I think many organizations do a good job of thinking about the central needs they satisfy, these consumption needs. Where they perhaps don't do such a good job is thinking about all of these related acquisition needs, the manner in which customers want to acquire the product. And I think a lot of those needs map on to many of the elements of customer experience. So that's really where I'm going to start in terms of customer experience. This is the framework I'm going to bring here. Is we can think about what might be some of customers' central acquisition needs. When you think about how a customer wants to acquire a product, what are the ways, the central ways in which they want that to occur? And I'm going to offer sort of two broad goals or needs that I think are important here. One is ease. Very simply, that customers want to acquire products easily. They want the process to be as straightforward as possible. I think many organizations, when you're in an organization, that organization occupies a huge amount of your thoughts. It's a central element of management and employees' lives. And it's very difficult for them to appreciate how someone outside of the organization views that particular organization. I think one of the mistakes we often make is we assume because our business is important to us, it must also be important to customers. Well, the truth is, for most customers, most businesses are not particularly important. And the manner in which they want to get the product is as quickly and as easily as possible. And that really speaks to the point I made earlier. When you add touch points, when you try to enhance interactions, when you try to engage customers, you're making an assumption that they want you to be a bigger part of their life. That is rarely true. It's certainly true for some brands, but for the bulk of brands, that is simply not true. They want to acquire the core product in the easiest way possible. So that's why I'm going to emphasize this as the number one acquisition need. I think there's something else that's worth discussing here too. Many of you may be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I'm just going to reference this for a moment. So Maslow basically came up with a hierarchy of needs, and that sort of went from these lower level needs that sort of have to be satisfied before these higher level needs can take effect. And the main point here is not to go into a detailed discussion of this, but simply to point out that once the basic ones are covered, so these basic needs and safety needs at the bottom of the pyramid, you get into these needs related to love or belonging and self-esteem. I'm not going to worry about self-actualization for the moment because I'm not too sure many people know precisely what Maslow was talking about. I certainly don't. He talked about self-actualization as being all you can be, but it's a little difficult to operationalize that. So I'm going to ignore that for the moment. But you can see some of these ones in the middle here, love and self-esteem. Love is very much about family, friends, connections, belonging. Self-esteem, not surprisingly, actually also has many of those same elements. Respect towards oneself, but also feeling respected by others. We can lump those two needs. One of the common elements of those two broad classes of needs is the manner in which we are perceived by others, whether we're loved, respected by others. And what this does is it really captures what I would characterize as an absolutely fundamental human need. And that is a need for respect, to be valued by others. This exists, of course, outside of a business context, outside of business relationships and customer interactions, but it also exists inside those interactions. And it can be difficult to think about exactly how organizations should handle this, but it is certainly something that is worth holding in mind. When your customers interact with you, they expect as a fundamental need to be treated in a manner that conveys respect. That is, in fact, respect is one of the most variables that is most correlated with life satisfaction across many cultures and is an extremely important element of interaction. So I think it's worth pointing out that this is almost certainly one of the most important of acquisition needs. So two things to hold in mind here: ease and respect in the context of acquisition and in the context of experience. Organizations, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these, aren't so good at either of these things. This is some data from another different Harvard Business Review article, and this one found that 56% of customers had to re-explain an issue when contacting customer service. 58% had to call in after using the so-called self-service website, and overall, nearly 60% of customers reported moderate to high effort. So this, of course, doesn't capture the experience with all organizations, but it does point out in many cases, customers' interactions with organizations are not easy. So one of the perhaps most important takeaways here is that if you want to improve customer experience, one of the broad things you should hold in mind is how do you make the entire journey easy for customers? Think about experience in terms of making it easy. I think this is a really useful guiding framework. Touch points can be instructed, as an example, and measured. I think that's important to mention too, to make things easy for their customers. How many times when you interact with a touch point does it seem as though ease, making life easy for the customer, is their number one priority? I would say that's rarely the case, and yet it can be easily implemented. The other element of this that I think is much harder for organizations to implement is that organizational silos, organizational procedures and processes very often take precedent, and yet they often make the experience for customers less easy. So it's really important to identify those silos, those procedures. Oftentimes these are procedures that organizations are put in place to make life easier for the organization, not for customers. These simply should not dictate the customer experience, yet there are many instances when they do dictate the customer experiences. Customers simply do not care or even know what organizational silos exist, what procedures exist within the organization, and it's a mistake to somehow subject customers to those silos or procedures if you want to create the best possible experience. In terms of measuring ease, there is a measure called the customer effort score. I'm not personally claiming that this is the absolute best measure of this, but it is a measure that's been published in the Harvard Business Review. It's a single item measure, which means it involves only one question, and it does a pretty good job of capturing the extent to which people perceived or how easy they perceived an interaction to be. The question is very simple. How much effort did you personally have to put forth to handle your request? The claim is that it's more predictive of loyalty than either the Net Promoter Score, which many of you are either familiar with or use, and also consumer satisfaction. I'm not sure. Certainly, there's some data that can be the case. I wouldn't be confident generalizing that particular finding. But the reason I like this particular measure is because not only does it capture an element of experience that I think many organizations overlook, and that is important to satisfaction, but also it helps provide touch points, frontline employees, with a guide about how to provide the best possible experience. If you're measuring how easy it is for customers, it's very easy for frontline employees to know what to do based on that. Much harder for them to know what to do based on NPS or a satisfaction measure. NPS, many frontline employees are measured on that. Net Promoter Score, which is essentially a measure of word of mouth, well, implicitly what you're telling employees is do something to customers that makes them most likely to positively recommend our company. Well, again, if you ask 10 different people, you're going to get 10 different answers about what that should be. I think ease is more directive. Okay, this is some of the data from that particular research in Harvard Business Review, pointing out that customer effort score seems to do a better job of predicting satisfaction. You can see it's more closely related to repurchase than satisfaction is. Again, I'm not confident this necessarily generalizes, but it does give you a sense that the measure seems to be tapping into something useful. I've got a brief example here that I think illustrates this notion of ease and how it can go astray in organizations. So this is from a case study. This is a true story about a lady who was looking to purchase a game, say Just Dance 4, I don't know if it was or it wasn't, for her daughter. She found the game online for approximately $30, but it was close to Christmas, so she wanted to make sure she got it in time. So she went to the store to buy it in person. So thinking about the customer journey, you can start to think about how easy things are for her. So she's seen it online, she decides to go to the store, she gets to the store, and she sees that the game is there, which is good, but it's priced at $47.97, so nearly $20 more expensive. So she remembers that the store has a price match guarantee. So she goes to the customer service rep and says, I'd like this game, I saw it online for $30, and you have a price match guarantee. At which point the customer service rep says, yes, we do, but we only match competitors' prices. We don't match our own prices. So you can start to imagine what this experience is like now. And this is dictated, of course, by the organizational policies that frontline employees' hands were presumably tied in this matter. So she says, okay, I'm going to go online right now, buy the product online, and order it for store pickup, because she remembered that you could actually pick it up in the store. So she does that. While she's there, she pays for it online, she orders it for store pickup, and says to the customer service rep, I'd like to pick it up, please. At which point he says, well, you can't pick it up because it has to come from, in order for inventory control, it has to come from wherever it comes from, and I have to have one delivered here specifically. I can't give you one off the shelf. So again, start to think about ease and organizational policies. So she had to go home, come back at a later time, and picked it up from the store at the price that she'd initially seen it for. Okay, so I mentioned this point before. That's really just an illustration. It's an extreme one, but it really goes to show how organizational procedures and organizational silos can really affect the experience in terms of reducing ease. And given that ease is one of the most important elements of experience, at least I'm claiming that, that's a real problem. Okay, there is one area I'm getting close to the end here, but I will just briefly mention this because one of the areas where we see the biggest divide in organizational silos is in digital and physical, the digital-physical mashup. Many companies run physical and digital operations independently, but customers really, truly move between these two seamlessly, and they expect them to be fused. This is a real source, and it was in that example, of a lack of ease or increased effort for customers. Here's some data that I think speaks to the value of why it's important to think about these customers who move across channels. This is from Medallia. Only 7% of people use online only, and only 20% of people in general use stores only. The vast majority, nearly 3/4 of people, use multiple channels to shop, both online and bricks and mortar. These multi-channel or omni-channel customers spend more in-store, they spend more online, and they have a 30% on average higher lifetime value. They are the most valuable customers, and yet this is an area where organizations, in many cases, have not sort of made things easy for people. A brief example of how powerful this can be, this is the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. In 2005, they had the worst customer satisfaction rate ranking in the industry. They were focused very much on reducing costs. So this was an organizational focus on costs, not on what may have actually affected customers' experience. And they were reducing branches like crazy. Eventually, with a change in management, they realized one of the central problems was that they had these completely independent physical and digital setups, which were creating huge problems for people. They focused on that, and they turned it around. So by 2014, they had the highest customer satisfaction ranking in the industry, achieved almost exclusively due to improved integrated physical and digital. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say for ease. I'm just going to finish up with some thoughts about and some evidence about respect here. Some data from a couple of scholarly psychology journals. These are some feeling respected is one of the primary correlates of individual happiness across many cultures. I mentioned that. In other words, feeling respected is fundamental to human well-being. The correlation between exclusionary experiences, in other words, disrespectful experiences, and self-esteem is enormously high. It's negative, of course. The more excluded you are, the lower self-esteem. But it's one of the primary predictors of how people feel about themselves. This is from the top journal in psychology. And the reason I'm simply pointing this out is that there is no reason to expect that these kinds of relationships do not exist in the context of customer business interactions too. I actually have some research that speaks to this. These are the results of a comprehensive satisfaction survey of nearly 3,000 consumers. And the purpose of this survey was just to quantify the extent to which respect affects satisfaction over and above the traditional causes. So the traditional causes being evaluation of the product, evaluation of the service, and expectations. Here are the results we found. So as you would expect, there was a strong positive relationship between product evaluation and satisfaction. There was a positive, significant, but not especially strong relationship between service and satisfaction. There was, you can't see this arrow very clearly, but there was a significant, not very strong negative relationship between expectations, which is consistent with the point I mentioned before, that expectations may have a negative effect on satisfaction. But as you can see, that's not a strong relationship, and what that probably means is it varies a lot depending on the nature of the product or some other context. And finally, and this was really the main insight here, once you accounted for all of those effects on satisfaction, respect still showed a strong, very strong, second only to evaluation of the product, significant effect on satisfaction. It is a crucial element of people's customers' overall satisfaction. I think respect is a little more nebulous than ease in terms of thinking about what organizations should do, but again, it's worth holding this in mind when it comes to establishing experiences that are most likely to create highly satisfied customers. So here are my takeaways. First off, I would say that it's really important to develop ideas in your organization about exactly what customers are trying to achieve and how they would like to do so. In other words, think about those consumption and acquisition needs. My guess is many organizations have already thought a lot about consumption needs, but maybe have put less energy into thinking about these acquisition needs. This is really the central element in any customer-focused strategy. So if you want to be customer-focused, what it means you're doing is you're looking to see what it is customers are trying to achieve. I would say that you need to be extremely careful about imposing your own ideas about what those needs might be. That's exactly what happened in the JCPenney case. Ron Johnson made assumptions about what customers would like in that context, and he was entirely wrong. But either way, organizations need to come up with some ideas about consumption and acquisition needs. I've suggested two particular acquisition needs that I think are important: ease and respect. And I would say they're important across many different contexts, which is why I focused on those. I think it's important to identify organizational structures that hinder customers in achieving either of those needs. And I think it can be really useful at a broad level to implement an easy mindset. Okay, that's where I'm going to finish. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Ashworth. We don't have a lot of questions, but we do have a couple. I'll pass that one along to you.
So first question here, what is the best way to know which touch points in the customer journey are worth keeping? Okay, that's a good question, and I like the sort of implicit assumption here, which is that it's really worth going through doing an audit of touch points and thinking about which ones are necessary, which ones are not, etc. That's really the purpose of, I didn't talk about customer journey mapping today, but that really is what the sort of implicit purpose of that is to audit all of these touch points and ultimately to ask which ones are necessary, whether we need to add any, and the part I would say is typically missing from customer journey mapping approaches is to really think carefully about which ones can we remove. I think there's no necessarily simple way of figuring out which ones are specifically worth keeping, but there's a number of things that I certainly would look for. One is the extent to which those touch points actually have contact with customers. So I mentioned that fewer than 50% of shoppers in malls tend to experience all touch points. It's worth getting a sense of which touch points seem to experience the greatest number of customers. Beyond that, there are other things you could do. If you measure satisfaction with those touch points, you can look at the extent to which satisfaction with the individual touch points predicts overall satisfaction and other things. That's another way of doing it. But actually, what I want to suggest is that really it's more of a theoretical question. You need to develop ideas about what it is customers want to do. Let's focus on ease. How do we make the journey as easy as possible for customers? And then you can ask yourself, what touch points, what are the minimum number of touch points that would be necessary to actually do this? You can look across your touch points at those that actually facilitate the journey, that facilitate acquisition, and really emphasize those over other touch points. I think many organizations would find that a number of their touch points are really designed to implement particular procedures that they have. If you want to make a refund, for example, if you want to refund a product or exchange a product or something, think about how you do that at a typical organization. They have specific touch points set up to deal with that are designed to assist them, not the customer. That's not how the customer would want to do it. And so if you adopt that ease mindset, it's probably, my guess is it's going to sort of change how you view all of those touch points overall and will cause you to recognize that there are a bunch of touch points that are there for our benefit, the organization's benefit, not customers, and they can probably go. So there's a few ideas. There are probably other ways of approaching that too, but that's some of the things that I think map onto the seminar today. So
we're almost out of time, so
okay.
I'm going to quickly ask another question on behalf of somebody who's listening. How much work should be done to understand and define audience segmentation prior to doing a touchpoint audit?
That's a great question. So lots of work on segmentation. I pointed out one of the central points here is that we need to develop ideas about what customers are trying to achieve and how they would like to do so. Segmentation involves recognizing that our customers likely have different things they're trying to achieve or would like to achieve those things in different ways. So right at the beginning of this, when you're thinking about what it is your customers are trying to achieve, you need to hold in mind the possibility that different customers will be looking to do different things. That is your segmentation analysis. That's where it comes in. So depending on how focused the business is, over how many market segments your operations span, you're going to have fewer or more of those segments, and they may require different touch points in order to do exactly what customers want. So yeah, good question. Absolutely needs to be considered at the very beginning.
We have 2 minutes to go. I'm going to see if I can squeeze one more in for you. Talking about customer satisfaction, having too many productions, for instance, in fashion products, makes things complicated for customers to make their choices. You made mention of limited choices. Is that time to address that?
Yeah. So there's a good deal of research that's been coming out over the last few years about the problems of too much choice. It's basically debilitating for customers. Yet at the same time, customers gravitate towards stores that offer them more choices. One of the things they think they want. I'm not going to recommend that you sort of as a universal prescription that you reduce the amount of choice you offer customers, but I will recommend for sure that one of the things you hold in mind, if you're an organization that offers customers choice, you need to provide them with easy ways of making that choice. You need to help them. Leaving them to their own devices is about the absolute worst thing you can do, because they may not make a good choice and they'll blame you for that, and that choice is going to be hard. So to map it back onto the ease idea, if you offer customers choices, I would say you need to think about how you can make choosing in that context easier for them.
Thanks very much, and that is the end of our hour. I would like to thank Dr. Ashworth for his time, and sorry to those of you whose questions we were not able to answer. Do know that you will be getting a recording of this presentation in 2 to 3 business days, so stay tuned for that. Thanks again for tuning in. Have a nice afternoon.